I'm Brionte. I'm the executive director at Georgia Conservation Voters. Thanks everybody for waiting so patiently. I expect more people to join us as we continue on throughout the call. And so we're going to get started with who we have now. And so the way that this is going to go is I'm just going to, introduce myself. I'll give Reverend Warnock an opportunity to talk and introduce himself as well. I've got a few questions for him. And afterwards, what we will do is open it up to Q&A. And so what we will do is go ahead and start with those questions. Oh, and just a note for Q&A, you can ask those questions in the chat box. You can also use the raise hand function. Pretty Zoom, so either one works just fine. And so also we're live streaming on YouTube for anyone who is on YouTube. And so we're taking questions there as well.
He looks at Michigan. He looks at states that have Democratic government.
I am going to mute everyone.
He looks at the rest.
And so when you do have a question, just drop it in the chat and raise your hand, and I can unmute you when we're ready. Okay. So I'm going to get started. Let me introduce myself again. I am Brionte McCorkle. I am the executive director of Georgia Conservation Voters. For those of you who don't know Georgia Conservation Voters, we work to advance policies for climate and environmental justice. We support elected officials who make climate and environmental justice a priority. And we hold elected officials accountable to their actions and votes. So I am very excited to be here today with Rev Warnock talking about this important topic, as well as how it's related to coronavirus and public health, which are climate change, coronavirus are two major challenges facing America and facing Georgians today. And without a doubt, we are living through some unprecedented times, and how we rise to the challenges before us will impact ourselves, it'll impact our children, and it'll impact generations to come. So now more than ever, it's really critical that we have leaders who are committed to passing policies and making the investments we need for a more just and sustainable future. Our elected officials should have clear positions on issues such as protecting health, public health, building a clean energy future, and supporting other actions to address climate change. So we'll dive in and explore some of those topics in this hour that we have with Reverend Warnock. It's really important that we've got candidates that stand up for these environmental values of clean air, clean water, and healthy and safe communities. So all of that said, I want to welcome Reverend Warnock, candidate for U.S. Senate here in Georgia, to introduce himself and to say a few remarks.
Well, thank you so very much, Brionte. It's great to be here with you and with the League of Conservation Voters and with the Georgia arm of that organization. It is particularly special to be here on Earth Day. So thank you for pulling together in this way at such a critical moment in the world, really, as we are dealing with a global pandemic. And I would love for us to talk a little bit about that and how this moment brings into sharp focus the issues that your organization spends so much time addressing, but a critical time for the world, for our country, and for our state. I am deeply honored just by the opportunity, really, to run for the United States Senate. I intend to win. Let me be very clear that I'm running to win. And that is so that I can do what I've spent my entire life doing, and that is I've spent my whole life committed to service. I got that. I developed that bug, if you will, the bug for service and the desire to make a difference. And this crazy idea that people who are committed and focused could actually change the world. I got that deep sense of calling early on in my life. And so I responded to the call to ministry. I grew up in public housing down in Savannah, Georgia, Caton Homes housing projects. Large family, very large family, mostly boys, well, and a lot of girls too, actually, a lot of every. And we didn't have a lot of money, but my family and my parents instilled in us a deep sense of values and commitment to others. And so I became the first college graduate in my family. I'm the child next to the baby. Went to Morehouse College, went on to seminary, graduate school, earned a PhD degree, became the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, the spiritual home of my hero, Martin Luther King Jr., whose own words and whose moral example and his willingness to put his own body in the struggle and somehow inspire others to literally lay it on the line for the future has always informed my idea of what it is meant for me to be a pastor and a moral and spiritual leader. And so that deep sense of commitment, that fundamental sensibility about what we ought to be up to while we're here on this earth has driven me to fight for poor and working class people, especially for ordinary people, to fight for health care and affordable and accessible health care, climate change, and creation care and care for the environment is caught up in my basic commitment to making sure that we all have a space here to live. I don't want to turn this into a sermon, and I didn't necessarily plan to say this, but I was, I'm a preacher. I'm a Baptist preacher, and in Baptist circles, particularly in the South, and particularly among evangelicals, there's a sense of salvation that and as I'm talking to you, it occurs to me that the ancient biblical understanding of salvation, that we don't get lifted up in the count because it's been narrow to this individual thing here, right? Is literally the broadening of communal space. That coming out of Exodus, out of the great tradition of the Hebrew Bible, is this idea that salvation is literally broadening the space so that everybody can flourish, so everybody can breathe. Yeah. So which is caught up in this idea of promise land, all of this. So for me, it's a moral calling, and it's also deeply practical. This is the only place we have to live. It's the only home we have. And so I've been committed to this work. I've literally been preaching about climate change for a long time now. And part of my passion as somebody who comes out of the mother of civil rights churches is to get people who are concerned about civil rights to recognize the ways in which they have a stake in this conversation about conservation. Yeah. And then to get the people who are focused on climate change and conserving and saving the environment, getting them to talk more about civil rights. Those things are tied together, and we see it in tragic fashion in communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by our inattention to these issues, that are negatively impacted, and who experience the least amount of benefit from the corporate greed, for example, that leads to some of the ecological damage that we're witnessing, and they share the brunt of the cost. It's always striking to me that race, even more than class, determines more than anything else where toxic waste dump is located. So Black folk, contrary to, I think, the way some folks see it, communities of color have been on the front line and engaged in this issue in different ways for a long time. I've served in urban contexts for most of my ministry of time. And so when I think about asthma and the higher rates of asthma in our communities, and then how that's playing out again in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, people with chronic diseases. So all of us are tied up, as Dr. King said, in a single garment of destiny, not just all human beings, but all creatures. And that what affects one directly affects all indirectly. That's what drives my values and my sensibilities about public policy. And that's what will inform me as the next United States Senator from the state of Georgia.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I mean, I know that for me, when I started in environment, I was just like, we got to save the planet. We've got so many things that need to be done to make sure that people and the planet that we live on is taken care of, that it's healthy and that it's thriving, as you say in your definition of salvation. Absolutely, as many of us thriving as possible. And the more that I got into the work of trying to advance different solutions here in Georgia on environmental issues, that link between environment and social justice, between protecting the environment, our right to clean air, our rights to clean water, and civil rights became super clear. The communities that are impacted the most are communities of color, and how are we engaging them in this conversation, and how are we making sure that the environmental movement and the environmental space is including them and making sure that they're showing up for issues that might not always immediately seem environmental, but do have a major impact. So, you know, one of the things that's been particularly concerning lately has been coronavirus, and that's been on everyone's mind. Even as I put together this conversation, I was like, I hope people don't think I'm, you know, over here talking in left field, but about something, you know, something that's not related, because they are very related. And you alluded to that in your opening message about coronavirus. The communities that are impacted the most are communities who are experiencing higher levels of air pollution, communities that have been on the front lines of a lot of the environmental injustices that have happened. And so before I go too far, I did want to take a moment to define environmental justice, because it's going to come up a lot, and I want to make sure that folks on the call know environmental justice. I think we assume people understand what it means, but it's not always clear. And the definition that sort of stuck with me was actually from Mustafa Ali, who was the head of the EPA's Environmental Justice Division for quite some time. And he said that environmental justice is basically the things that no one else wants. They place them in communities of color, low-income communities and indigenous lands. They become the sacrifice zones for coal-fired power plants, like, for example, that plant Shear in Monroe County, for certified animal feeding operations that are actively trying to expand here in Georgia, for waste treatment facilities, for unhealthy housing, where we find lead, and so many other impacts are happening. The things that no one else wants, they place them in communities of color. And in essence, the environmental justices that continue to happen are happening to people of color, low-income communities, and coronavirus in particular has made these inequalities more obvious. So moving into that discussion, there's data that has come out and studies from Harvard University linking low-income communities, low-income communities and Black communities with higher mortality rates. And they're saying it's because of air pollution. We've got lots of respiratory illnesses that are made worse by air pollution, caused by air pollution, and coronavirus coming in and compounding those illnesses is deadly for a lot of folks. And Metro Atlanta in particular is among the top 25 cities with the highest levels of year-round pollution. And we've got communities like DeKalb, Fulton, Gwinnett, and Henry County that are all still working to improve their air, and they're currently receiving a failing grade from the American Lung Association's State of the Air report. And that's based on data from 2019, so it's still recent and it's still relevant. Those counties are among the 7 Georgia counties that are still in federal violation of standards for ozone levels. And so in other words, the air quality isn't so hot in Georgia, and in particular Georgia's metros, where a lot of the African-American community in our state lives. And it's also, as you mentioned, where we're seeing higher rates of things like asthma. So I have a question for you, and it's really whether you support legislation that strengthens compliance with the President's Order on Environmental Justice. So this was passed in '94, and it mandates that each federal agency make efforts to achieve environmental justice, that it must be part of their mission, and that they should identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health effects of their programs, their policies, and their activities on low-income communities and communities of color. So do you support legislation that strengthens that presidential order to make EJ part of federal agencies' decision making?
The answer is yes. I think that environmental justice is absolutely the right term, and thank you for lifting that up. And because it pulls together those two communities that I said need to be talking to one another more and more, that folks who are concerned about environment, folks who are concerned about civil rights or justice, if you will. For me, environmental justice takes into account those communities that are marginalized or disproportionately impacted by ecological disaster. I think we also need to be just to the earth itself. So for me, that's part of the definition that from my own perspective, I think we need to be kind to the earth and be a good neighbor in the neighborhood. So the answer is yes, and it is because issues around environmental justice ought not be seen as yet another issue to sort of check off on the checklist. I think the only way to really address it is to do it integrally, like that whatever your area, it's not all of the different cabinet secretaries, all of the different departments of our government ought to take into their analysis and their plan about how they go about their business this issue of environmental justice. If you don't, the work doesn't get done.
Absolutely. I think it definitely needs to be something that's committed to by all the departments and not just pigeonholed in one department. So coronavirus, COVID-19, it presents great danger to the global economy. I think this is where most people are right now. They're worried about the uncertainty coming with the economy. There's some predictions that this could be as bad or worse than the financial crisis of 2008. And what we know about recessions, sort of continuing with this theme of EJ, is that recessions affect the most vulnerable in our society. The sick, the elderly, people of color, low-income Americans, all of those folks will be the ones to experience the recession firsthand. And again, these are the groups that are on the front lines of current environmental pollution, also will be on the front lines as we start to feel more and more impacts from a changing climate. But what I've actually been able to hold on to as a bit of hope is that there will need to be some investment in the economy to get things moving again after all of this has happened. And I see that need to invest as an opportunity to invest in improving our nation's electricity grids, its energy pipelines, water systems, the transportation infrastructure and public buildings. I mean, investing in that kind of thing after a recession is not unheard of. It is a part of American history. It's how we rebounded. And so I see this as an opportunity to really make the kinds of high level investments that were called for in the Green New Deal, for example. And so if you were following the Green New Deal, it called for massive investments in infrastructure, planning for climate change, creating 100% clean energy economy, building more efficient and affordable public transportation, using nature-based and green techniques for water infrastructure, all of this while providing good family sustaining jobs. So my question to you is, do you support that kind of infrastructure agenda that's fair, that's equitable, and that advances this clean energy economy that we're striving for?
I think that we have in this moment an opportunity to think about what kind of country we want to be and the direction that we want to go. And so I have long been interested in infrastructure as a way of putting our folks back to work. And I've long been interested and concerned about environmental justice. So those are things that you'll see me continue to lift up, both as a candidate and then in the Senate. That those are the values that will lead me as I engage in the work of legislation, you know, with the sausage making that's involved with that. You know how messy and how complicated that is. What I am clear about is my values. Number one, my fundamental commitment to a just and humane world, a world that we can all occupy and actually continue to live in. And I do think that recessions bring into clearer focus some of the things that we assume aren't affordable, that we can't do. All of a sudden we see that the resources are there. Sometimes the principles and the commitments aren't there. So coming out of the kind of moral tradition that I stand in as pastor of Dr. King's church, you'll see me lift that up as we engage in an important debate about how we get to where we need to be.
Awesome. It's always good to have a great, strong moral compass when you're working on legislation in Congress. And so I want to go back to air pollution for a moment. Our communities in Georgia have been experiencing all kinds of threats to air quality. And I'm sure you've probably heard of the ethylene oxide leaks happening in Smyrna and South Fulton and Covington, Georgia, where companies have been putting out high levels of known cancer-causing chemicals in the air, and these releases have been allowed to continue with no clear reporting to the public. Further down south, we've got other air quality issues showing up in the form of biomass power plants in Madison and Franklin County. Those are areas where the community is sort of up in arms about some burning of chemical-laced rail ties that's causing really poor air quality. Also lots of reports of other effects like fish kills and things like that. That biomass plant actually failed its emissions tests. But what we're seeing is that we've got some regulations in place, laws in place that are here to protect human health and environment, but they are being violated and not necessarily being held accountable. So do you support protecting the funding necessary to enforce laws that protect human health and environment and to take civil or criminal action against violators?
The answer is yes. I mean, let's face it, enforcement, as you point out, in a way, even in the question, that's the issue. often. You can have laws, whether they're environmental laws or civil rights laws on the books, but there are ways other than getting rid of the law itself to undermine what the law is supposed to accomplish. So we've seen that. We're witnessing it right now generally with the EPA. And again, we're talking about these connections. We've seen it in civil rights offices of the government that's supposed to preserve civil and human rights. There are all kinds of ways to undermine what the law is supposed to support. So absolutely, I am committed to the kind of robust laws that will make sure that people are protected, that women and folks living in Covington aren't worried about developing cancer, and that our children are safe. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old.
Wonderful.
And so I'm thinking always about them and about the kind of world that they deserve to inhabit. And I think this COVID-19 moment, if you will, is a kind of, it's tragic on its own face. A few weeks ago, I preached a sermon entitled The Parable of a Pandemic, because it's tragic on its own face, but it's kind of a parable for a whole range of issues that I think we need to think about generally. And right now, all of us are experiencing in an extreme way what it's like for it literally be unsafe to go outside, where you're concerned that the thing you might be breathing in may kill you. Yeah. Well, that's the case. That's the case every day, which is why we have to have laws that both support and enforce the ability to have clean air and clean water. But this moment, I think, is instructive and gives us a chance to amplify the issue of environmental justice, and to ask ourselves and to ask others, what could be more fundamental? What's more basic than the ability to go outside and to move around and to know that it's safe to do so? That's what's at stake. And we can't have corporations playing games with that.
Not at all, not at all. I too also have a small child, she's 4. She definitely deserves to have a future where she's not afraid to go outside and breathe the air. So let's talk a little bit more about what it'll take to reduce some of these air emissions. One of the interesting things about COVID-19 is how much cleaner the air has been now that people are sheltering in place. It's sort of been a pretty dramatic transformation in place in Atlanta and Georgia, across the world. We're seeing lots of pollution levels just plummeting. And it's really because there's limited air travel. There are fewer cars on the road. There's reduced energy consumption. So all of these things are things that environmentalists have been calling for quite some time. And so I want to start with transportation and transportation policy, because it is the largest sector, the largest single source of climate pollution in the US is coming from transportation, is coming from people sitting in their cars, stuck in traffic. And so one of the things that we've seen happen to try to address this are clean car standards. The Obama administration passed a rule that had lots of standards for automakers to adhere to. We've seen the Trump administration take those rules and basically rewrite them. And so my question to you is, do you support strong clean car standards and protecting states' authority under the Clean Air Act to adopt stricter state level standards?
Yeah, the answer is yes. It's absolutely critical. And I say that as somebody who lives in Atlanta. Atlantans we love our cars. Yeah, absolutely. I support that. I also support legislation that would create more rail and
Awesome.
increase the public transportation infrastructure. That's part of the infrastructure
Yes.
investments that we need as you talk about the ways in which we have to address this across the entire government, all of these different agencies. Transportation, and I was thinking about that earlier, didn't say transportation comes to mind as one of those places where we begin to address this issue. Because not only would we by investing in rail, for example, would we in a place like Atlanta or outside of Atlanta, as we try to build an infrastructure to connect these communities, not only is it a kinder thing to do for the environment, creating less smog and pollution. Again, all the ways in which all these things are connected, there are communities that are literally cut off from where the jobs and possibilities for prosperity are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there is a low level of upward mobility, ironically, even in the civil rights capital of the country, where, you know, this is Atlanta. It's, you know, you see people of color thriving and in leadership. The other side of this story, and I don't want to talk about Atlanta, I'm running, let me be really clear, for the Senate in Georgia. But it's an ironic thing. The upward mobility of Black children in Atlanta is not terribly great.
Mm-hmm.
So literally people aren't mobile in terms of class, which is connected to their actual lack of mobility. That they literally can't get from one place to the other in order to create the kind of prosperity that allows people to keep the dreams, to keep the promises that we all make to our children. So that's my long answer to, yes, I support robust standards for cars. I've embodied it in my own choices about the kinds of cars I drive. And I think in addition to that, investments in transportation, for example, is absolutely critical.
Yes, awesome. Thank you for tackling. That was actually my secondary question, but you already handled it. Definitely need to invest in transportation. Actually, that's you can't see it, but there's a Expand MARTA sign behind me, because that's where I spent a lot of time working in the environmental space.
And I'm from Savannah, Georgia. So the other piece is, you know, is how do we connect the communities in the South and the other parts of the state with Metro Atlanta? How do we connect all of these communities as we think about the future? Yeah.
And we saw there were lots of conversations and there still are really wonderful, robust plans for rail throughout Georgia, going all the way down to Columbus, through middle Georgia, out to the coast. And those things we need more federal support for. So it's good to know that you understand the importance of investing in that kind of infrastructure.
Those things will not happen without the support of the federal government.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to energy. There's a lot of conversation about transitioning to 100% clean energy in this country right now. It is necessary to avert the worst impacts of climate change. Also creates tons of good jobs, boosts the economy, it saves people money, and of course has that added benefit of protecting our health because we're reducing emissions from that sector. We know that clean energy is growing rapidly as the prices for it have plummeted. And as a result, we've got a huge solar industry, huge wind industry. And so solar and wind and geothermal are places that environmental communities would like to see more investment, and also investment in energy efficiency as well, using less energy in the first place. So my question to you is whether or not you support transitioning to 100% clean energy by 2050 to help build pollution-free communities.
The answer is yes, I support that. Again, nothing is as basic as clean air and clean water. You've got to have clean energy to get there. I think we need to be not only committed to that, but we have to be smart and thoughtful about how we get there. I think we have to consider all the various paths that allow us to get there. But the commitment itself is absolutely critical. I think it is embarrassing, quite frankly, that we got out of the Paris Accords. And, you know, part of what I would be pushing from a position of leadership in the Senate is that we renew our commitment to these international standards for reducing greenhouse gases so that we can get to where we need to be. The planet is the neighborhood, and the United States should not be lagging behind the 195 countries that signed on to the accord. We should be leading and not lagging behind. It is a moral scandal on the soul of our country that we've gotten outside of that, the Trump administration pulled us out of the agreement. I'd like to see us renew that commitment and then build even beyond that in terms of our commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. And so thinking about the transition to clean energy, to 100% clean energy, one of the things that's on a lot of folks' mind about energy in Georgia is Plant Vogtle, the nuclear plant. Georgia Power customers are all over the state, and they're on the hook for billions to complete the plant. So is nuclear energy a part of the solution in your eyes? And what do you think about how it's been paid for so far with ratepayer dollars?
Yeah, again, I'm committed to getting us to clean energy by 2050. And I think if we're serious and committed to that, I think nuclear power certainly has to be on the table and a part of that conversation. At the same time, I am aware of the cost overruns with Plant Vogtle, and I think that it's not fair. It's quite unfortunate that Georgia's ratepayers have been left on the hook to handle those cost overruns. Here's an example of the ways in which we have to hold corporate interests accountable, which is why I don't accept corporate PAC money. Yeah, I think nuclear has to be on the table. At the same time, we have to have a network of accountability so that we keep rates under control and that we hold management accountable, particularly when taxpayer dollars are already invested in the effort.
Awesome. Yeah, accountability is important, and I think it's great that you don't take that corporate PAC money. I've been doing a little bit of research on money giving in Georgia, and we know that it's being spread around. So I have one more question about energy, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. There's so much good stuff to ask, but this is the 10-year anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which is still devastating communities, had a really big impact on the coastal species, the animals and fish and things that relied on that ecosystem. It also had an impact on people. Some folks lost their lives in that incident, and of course, the region took a really dramatic hit industry-wise. A lot of the things that they were doing industry-wise were affected. And so there's been some proposal to, in some calls by the administration to drill off of Georgia's coast, to drill in the Atlantic. What are your thoughts on offshore drilling? Do you support it? Do you oppose it? Let me know what you think.
As a kid who was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, I am opposed to offshore drilling in our coastal areas. And I think it's quite unfortunate that politicians continue to ignore or deny the science. And kind of circling back to where you began, we're witnessing it again this week with the whole coronavirus pandemic and the response of elected officials to this issue. It's very clear that none of us should be going outside right now, that we shouldn't be ignoring the whole sheltering in rules, I should say a little bit more carefully, but that we shouldn't be going back to business as normal. There's no question about that. The data is clear that it is much too soon for us to be returning to business as usual. So something other than the science and the data is informing the decision that, yeah, Friday is a good day, the day after tomorrow, to return, of all places, to nail salons and beauty salons and tattoo parlors. Say a little carefully, but that we shouldn't be going back to business as normal. There's no question about that. The data is clear that it is too soon. Hear myself again. Turning to business as usual. So something other than the science and the data is informing.
All right, let's try that again. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I'll continue. So clearly something other than the science and the data is informing this terrible decision this week. I'll admit to you, I'm dying to go to the gym, but I'm not willing to die to go to the gym. Stressed out as I am, could use a good workout to figure out how to get that done at home. And by the same token, the science is clear about a whole range of these issues that we're talking about. And it's clear with respect to the risk involved with offshore drilling. And we shouldn't be expanding that proposition. We should be committed, not just because on moral grounds, but on practical grounds to clean energy. And which, by the way, is not only the right thing to do with respect to the environment, it is the most viable path to prosperity as we think about where the real jobs are and what the future of the economy will actually look like.
Absolutely. So I am going to take a moment to pause here to see if we have any questions from folks on the phone or who are on their video. I'm going to unmute people and let's see how that goes. In case some folks aren't using the aren't as familiar. Does anybody have questions so far? And yeah, feel free to mute yourself if you don't have a question. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions in the Zoom. Let me check online here. I had one question someone submitted via email prior to this, and they were actually asking about climate science, citizens' climate science. There's a lot of federal funding dedicated to programs to support citizens going out and doing things like Adopt a Stream, air testing and water testing. Do you support more funding for those programs, the continued funding for those programs was the question?
I support the idea that the work of getting to the kind of environmental future that our children deserves is collective work. So I'll need more time to look specifically into this, the very specific initiative that you raised. But that is collective work that we all have to own.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. since I'm not getting any questions in the chat, I'm going to ask a couple more that I had on my list, if that's all right. Are you familiar with
Looks
the?
like somebody, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, here we go. We got some questions. Do you support carbon tax legislation?
I think we need to be moving away from an economy that's based on, you know, fossil fuels. That's the way of the past, and we need to be moving towards the future. The issue of taxes and how much, yeah, that's a conversation that I think, you know, I want to participate in, and I'll bring my values and commitment to getting there to the conversation.
And I have another question from Bonnie. How do you think we can get bipartisan support for climate change action? It's a good question.
How do we get bipartisan support? I think, you know, I think that there's a way in which there's already bipartisan support. And I think we're blind, we don't necessarily hear it because of the way the news cycle and the political conversation happens in our country. Like there are a whole range of things. Maybe there are degrees to which, given whether, you know, where these partisan divides, but there are ways in which there is already consensus among Americans on a range of things that you can't always get done. And there's a disconnect between where citizens actually are and the legislation that actually gets passed. And that has more to do with the chokehold that corporate interests have over our politics, sometimes than the differences between citizens. So I don't want to suggest, you know, I want you to understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that there are no differences between Democrats, Republicans on this issue. Clearly there are. But very often there's more bipartisan support for getting some reasonable things done than you might think. We see it, for example, in the whole reasonable gun control issue. There's some places where there's some common ground among Americans, even those, you know, on both sides of the aisle. And we don't. And the question is, how is it that we don't even manage to get those things done? And it's because of the way the outsized influence of corporate interests on our politics. So I think that that's the issue. And what I will try to do and what I'm trying to do in my campaign is to embody a vision of our democracy where the people's voices are heard.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, what's interesting about that is that we've seen a lot of really strong support for things like the Land and Water Conservation Fund from the Republican Party. So more of a conservation lens. And so, you know, I think the challenge is moving from just protecting the public lands to that vision of like the future. You know, what are we investing in? How are we really pivoting systems?
And then in addition to that, I would say we have to push back hard against this false choice between saving the environment and saving jobs. The data and the analysis is really on the side of those of us who want to make sure we conserve and we preserve the planet, not just on the front of environmental justice, but when you think about the actual future of the economy. And we have to continue to push hard against that false choice. And that's something that we continue to do in the United States Senate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's often pivoted as two things against each other. But as we talked about earlier, you know, the opportunity is that we could, you know, create a really strong economy and create lots of jobs. And so, yeah, that is, I think, all the questions I see coming in. There is a sort of a follow-up to the citizen science question about how to get the EPA to react, but I know that's more an administrative question. Got to do with our leader in office right now.
We got to get somebody else in charge of the EPA. And the road to get there leads right through Georgia. And so I hope that I can count on you to support my candidacy for the Senate. We need to win both of these seats, and we need to get control of the Senate and control of the Oval Office so that we can actually put people in those offices. Imagine having an EPA administrator who's not actually an opponent of the EPA. That'll help us get us a long way in the right direction.
Absolutely. And then I know I said that was the last one, but someone actually asked one juicy one, so we'll make this the last question. And it's really about how you envisioned protecting coastal Georgia as we head into hurricane season. So, you know, we talk a lot about environment and sustainability, and then there's resilience also, how we, you know, protect our communities from these disasters and bounce back. So do you have thoughts on how we can protect Georgia's coast as we head into hurricane season?
Well, part of the reason I'm excited about my partnership, hopefully, and ongoing conversation with the league is that I need, you know, subject matter experts to continue to bounce ideas off of. I don't want, for me, this is not a thing where you go and you hopefully get people's support and they don't hear from you again. I want this to be an ongoing dialogue. I think these issues are complicated. You know, our world is complex. How do you balance various interests in order to get to where we need to go? But I'll tell you this, my mother lives in Savannah, Georgia, mm-hmm. and most of my siblings live there. And I know all about hurricane season on the coast. One of my most vivid memories as a child is being a 9-year-old. Oops, I'm revealing my age now. When Hurricane David came through Savannah, Georgia. And I remember how striking that was for me as a 9-year-old as we began to take cover and wonder what would happen. As it turned out, we avoided we dodged a bullet. And I don't think there was any loss of life, as I recall, from Hurricane David. And then from the years since then, when I was a 9-year-old and I'm now 50, we've seen in recent years these storms, not only on the coast of Georgia, but everywhere in New York, for God's sake, where I spent my 20s getting through graduate school. We've seen these storms and hurricanes get stronger and stronger. We'll have the hottest year on record until the next year. And that year becomes the hottest year on record until the next year, when that year becomes the hottest year on record. And we've seen that happen time and time again. We don't have a lot of time. Climate change is already here. And we see it with these hurricanes that devastate communities along the coast. We see it show up in flooding. We see it show up in droughts. And so we need leaders who will approach this with the kind of seriousness and urgency that the issue demands. And I pledge to you my absolute commitment to do that. Not simply to win your endorsement, but to win the future for my children. And I will need you as principled interlocutors and conversation partners so that work can continue.
Absolutely. So this was great. I appreciate all your thoughts on these really important topics. I had like 20 more. Environment is a big topic, but we've only got just a minute or two left. Is there anything else you want to say before I bring this to a close?
Well, you know, when a preacher says in closing, they say pay him no mind or pay her no mind, because they've got 2 or 3 more closings. But no, I appreciate again the time spent. This is such a vital an important conversation. It's one that I hope we'll be able to continue. There's so very much at stake. And this is a tough time for all of us. And we're being challenged in so many ways. I sat here in this space a couple of weeks ago and conducted a funeral on this very platform. I thought that's nothing I never could have imagined doing just a couple months ago for one of my parishioners who died from COVID-19. Football coach, father of 16-year-old twin daughters. This crisis and the urgency that it presents reminds us of the ways in which we're all connected to one another and the work that we must do so that we can have a future worthy of our children and the promises that we give to our children. So I hope that I can call on you as partners in that work. So very much is at stake, and I thank you so very much for the time. All
right. Well, wonderful. I'll be in touch. I'll keep talking to you. Hopefully you'll see a lot more of the folks on this call and a lot more people out beyond this. We'll make this video available for people to watch after. We'll put it on our YouTube channel and allow folks to watch it as needed. So otherwise, everybody have a lovely night. Enjoy this time. Stay home and stay safe. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.